Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the OECD Forum and this first session on what brings us together, first panel session, I should say. Obviously, we've had the introduction from the Secretary-General already. If you saw the video a little bit earlier, I think there were some very interesting questions brought up in that about the idea of how we need to do better as a society to find those elements that unite us. And also, one of the comments I took away from that was what counts most is feeling good. This at a time, of course, we know the global economy is improving, but there are divisions in our society that appear more and more present than ever before. Inequality on the rise. Many people find themselves in the position of being part of the working poor. Trust in institutions is falling. Technology improving the lot of many, but also presenting new challenges for us as well and magnifying some of the divisive issues that exist around the world. So the question that we're looking at is what brings us together? How can we restore that trust and work together across borders and across communities on this issue? To discuss this, I'm joined by, beside me, Nate Bacharczak, who's the co-founder of Airbnb, Sharon Burrow, who's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, Minouche Shafiq, who is the Director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, Bishop David Urquhart, the Bishop of Birmingham, the Vice Chair of the UK's All-Party Parliamentary Group on Inclusive Growth, and Maria Rosaria Tadeo, the Deputy Director of the Digital Ethics Lab. Thank you all very much for being here this morning. We are talking about the idea of common values and shared values, and I suppose let's start with a question as, can we say that there are shared values that exist between us? As we get into that question, you'll be aware that we have the BCast application. If you want to get involved in the conversation, you can use Twitter and the hashtag OECD1 or using the BCast application that will allow you to get involved in this conversation. We'll pick up on your comments during the discussion too. So this question of, are there common values? Are there shared values? Minouche Shafiq, can we start with you?
I think there are some common values and that one can identify around the world. Most people prefer peace to war. Most societies have a sense of fairness embedded in them. All societies have systems for looking after people who are vulnerable, and usually it's some combination of the family, the community, the state, and the market. Now, different societies organize themselves differently to express those values. A sort of a simple typology might run from the sort of individualism of the United States, where those values are expressed in a way that the individual bears a lot of the responsibility for their life outcomes, to a sort of more collectivist approach in many Asian countries. And in Europe, there's the European social model, which tries to combine both individual rights, but some collective sharing of responsibilities. So I think there are many common values, and societies express those values and organize themselves around those values in different ways.
Bishop David, how would you say that this is something that are these common values under threat?
I think one of the exciting things about today and this sort of conference is that we are aware of other starting points for our values. And if we're in Europe, a Eurocentric view of the world has some of the things that Minouche has already mentioned, particularly about individualism. But if we start our history from the subcontinent or from China, then we will find ourselves building up an understanding of ourselves and society from a very different starting point. And that's one of the exciting things about today.
Sharon Burrow, if I can turn to you next. We're looking at a time in the world where there are lots of discussions about how we should be applying these shared values, how we should be cooperating across different areas. Work is something that is universal to the experience. How are these shared values being lived by workers?
Well, if you go back to the fundamentals, what makes people, how do you realise those shared values? Security, acting together, and indeed the optimism of a shared future. And yet all of that's fractured in our world. If you've got massive inequality, if you can't live on minimum wages, if social protection has broken down, if collective bargaining is actually now the antithesis of a corporation's mode of operation, that they don't want to work with their workers to share productivity. And if you want a figure that shows that, then you only have to look at societies like the US, where in fact productivity is probably something like 250 times higher, percentage times higher, and yet we're actually seeing working people who can't live on the wages they earn every day. And yet we're fighting each other about shared prosperity in a world where corporate greed dominates. And then, of course, as Manoush said, that, you know, when you look at conflicts, we've got more than 50 conflicts in the world, and our military spend's higher than World War II, while our schools and our hospitals and our shared infrastructure is in dreadful decline. So in order to strengthen values, you have to realise them. And by any, you know, kind of set of indicators, we are seeing a more fractured world, not a more cohesive world.
Nate, Airbnb is described as being part of the sharing economy. How does a company like yours, I suppose, interact with this idea of shared values across borders and across communities?
Well, I think first we're seeing a huge shift generationally. There's the rise of the millennial generation really coming into its prime now, and it's more than half the population in places like Asia, so it's quite a large generation. And this generation has shared context. You know, this is a native digital generation that has really grown up with the tools of the digital age, knows how to use them. I think this is a generation that has shared context around the challenges of the future, like the environment. I see a lot of similarities around the world about how young people view the environment. This is also a generation that how they consume has changed. It's less about ownership now, and it's more about experiences. And this all plays into Airbnb and our success. You know, Airbnb is certainly made possible through technology, and the technology is you know, the internet, mobile, and the fact that it doesn't matter where on the planet you are, you can now communicate with one another, and that there have now constructs that exist in these digital platforms that allow you to engage in meaningful commerce, specifically travel. Tourism travel, it's 10% of the economy. It's a huge industry, and now ordinary people around the globe are able to plug in and offer something of value. And so they're participating economically, but in doing so, they're also crossing boundaries socially. So, you know, people from around the world are meeting each other. We like to sometimes refer to what Airbnb does as the UN at every kitchen table, meaning that, you know, guests and hosts from different countries are getting up in the morning and sharing a breakfast, while also making some income and having a value exchange. But the value exchange is more than just commercial. It's also those conversations that I think result in a lot of shared understanding and gives me hope for the future.
I think we can all agree that breakfast is a shared value amongst all of us. Rosaria, Digital Ethics UK, this is your domain of how technology interacts with people. Is technology helping us to become more human or less?
Well, my point is that it can be used to become more human than we ever been. Going back to the points that were made before, there is a fundamental, not just a shared values, which is the one of human dignity, which is something that is shared across the world. And if we focus on that, when we think about how we design, develop, regulate the use of technologies, then technologies can allow us to express our potential, to flourish as human beings, to do more, to do better, to be more bold. The whole point is to understand how we make sure that this is the path through which we steer technologies and we don't get tempted on the other side. And just one little point following up to what the Bishop said, I should say I'm a philosopher and an ethicist, so I like to think about in universal terms. There is something that we have to understand, that the digital revolution is not just a technological revolution. It has redefined the way we understand fundamental values. What human dignity means today is not the same thing that meant 50 years ago. What being a human is today is not what it was 50 years ago. So there is a new way of understanding these values. There is a new way to make sure that we can implement these values. We need regulations which are able to foster this new understanding. And there is a new way in which these values go together in a global sense. We are able to have business in China, have friends in the US, live in the UK, talk to my mother every day in Naples. How do we make sure that this is used for the best? So we need to have this approach which is a bit more fundamental and think about how reality is being changed by digital technologies in order to be able to ask your questions, how technology can make us more humans.
Okay, Bishop David, is this something that we're focusing enough on, this idea of, I suppose, using the technology that we have to ensure for good and to ensure that we're sort of coming back to the important values?
I think this discussion takes us back to a very personal state, particularly if we are leaders in our fields, as to how we operate personally in our lives, and what resources do we have, what authority do we draw on for our values, for our behaviors. And so this is quite challenging in the excitement of the 21st century, where we're adventuring in the human experiment as never before, and we've got all sorts of new things to think about, but at the same time we are personal, we are uniquely individual, but we're made to be together, we're made to be corporate, we're made to be in company. That's the human animal, that's how we are. So there is something very, very important still about face-to-face. And I think that in terms of some of our dilemmas, perhaps I ought to say this now, one of the things we're noticing in our own city region in UK of Birmingham, which is very, very diverse and has a number of the major questions that are being raised by this conference day to day in the citizens, whether it's inequalities, diversity, economic global challenges, that we need to, in addition to all the technology and all the advantages, to still be face-to-face. And that's when it becomes really, really difficult. So, for example, we have a Poverty Truth Commission, where we bring people who are very poor together for a year and people who are very powerful together for a year, and then we ask them to meet together to tell their stories to each other. This is transformative, both for the weak and the poor and the strong. We also, just to get in the interfaith side, bring the 6 main religions together in our city so that they can listen together as to what drives them, what motivates them, where the differences are. We can talk in a safe way. So face-to-face and personal development is very, very important for each one of us.
Sharon Burrow, how important are those conversations to be had?
Well, dialogue is extraordinarily important, and I want to come back to the question of reform of multilateralism and the role of dialogue. But I wanted to say something about technology. It's not the technology. All our global polling shows us that people are not terribly worried about the technology. There is some ethical issues. It's the business model. It's actually the fact that you've got now the richest men in the world who are simply using technology in a way that is undermining the security of work. And so when, in fact, you have people who have gone to university for 4 years, who are maybe journalists, who now can earn as little as $15 a day across an internet platform in Europe, because that's the price of an article, you can't live on that. You can't live on 50 or 60, which is what the reputational high end is in the journalism environment. And that's, so we're not only talking about the Deliveroos and the Airbnbs and the, you know, the Amazons and others. They need regulation. There's no question about that. Technology's here to stay, but how do we regulate it? What's the dignity of work? And I just want to remind people that, in fact, the stories are critical because 50% of the world's people are not connected to the internet. And I was in Ethiopia just last month. I found the lowest minimum wage in the world, $20 a month, and they're working for very wealthy European countries. So have our companies, so have our values broken down? Hell yes, as I would say. And indeed, are we going to fix it? Because it's not that we don't have the answers. We have the answers, but unless we have the CEOs and the bright young entrepreneurs and the governments and the unions and civil society talking together about what kind of shared futures we have, then you're going to see more of the same.
Nate, is this something that Airbnb thinks about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the imperative for everybody is to learn how to adapt. You know, technology only goes in one direction. It's only going to go forward, and there's implications to the change that technology brings. And some of it is negative, some of it is positive. And the question is, and I think the challenge is that as technology moves faster and faster, how are we in the real world able to adapt faster and faster? So, for example, with automation and job displacement, how do we move faster and faster in terms of retraining and reorienting ourselves? I think that's a real challenge. There's also, of course, real opportunities and new capabilities that these technologies bring. And I think the key is, when striking the balance, is to make sure you don't kill the golden goose, because your traditional regulation, that has to adapt too. And so it's not a question of whether to have regulation or not. It's about how to have modern regulation that is applicable to 21st century technology and business models. And sometimes the business models will need to change because sometimes there are perverse incentives, and those need to be corrected or complemented.
Manu Shafiq, you wanted to come in on this?
In terms of that adaptation, I think one has to be quite clear about the policy implications. And, you know, retraining and reskilling is obviously essential to help workers adapt to the risks that automation brings. But if you look at most countries in the world, they grossly underspend on reskilling workers and training. Grossly. I mean, just to give a ballpark, the one country I can think of that does a pretty good job is Denmark. They spend 1.7% of GDP. That's the size of most countries' military budgets, just to give you an order of magnitude of how much resources you need to spend to equip your workers to be able to adjust to a rapidly changing labor market. How would you pay for that? Well, let's go back to the issues, the research that was done here at the OECD on what's happened to the progressivity of our income tax systems. OECD research shows that over the last 20 years, income tax systems in OECD countries have become less progressive because most countries have reduced top tax rates, reduced corporate tax rates, and increased VAT, which is a very regressive tax because it falls more heavily on the poor. And so unless one reverses this trend in taxation, which would help both reduce inequality, but also enable us to finance the kinds of schemes that would help people who are falling behind adjust and thrive in the new economy.
Sharon Burrow, is this something that needs to be tackled at an international level? Do countries need to speak to each other about how to deal with these challenges?
Well, it needs to be tackled at every level. I mean, the business model, in terms of values, ought to be universal. Businesses ought to be registered where they do business. They ought to actually pay their taxes, of course, where they earn them. They need to be responsible for contributions to social protection, depending on the system, and they need to take responsibility for workers. You know, in Singapore last week, the government rejects that, you know, workers working for Deliveroo or Uber or other platform businesses that are service-oriented are not dependent workers. They are dependent workers. They depend on somebody else giving them work. So I agree we need to adapt regulation, absolutely. But we also need to look at what the rights are that underpin that. And the big issue here is trust. And nobody trusts each other anymore because they can't live with some security if you're not earning enough and you don't have social protection. So you see the casualties, which are xenophobia and of course, you know, ultimately conflict. But, you know, beyond the model, we have to actually be open enough to say, well, you have to not expect the profit that you are expecting. You have to pay tax, obviously, as Manu said, but it's also shared responsibilities. Again, I just say, people talk about lifelong learning. It's vital, but we've been talking about it for 25 years. And the only area I've seen recently where business and unions have cut a really good deal is in Sweden, where it will often rely on the state, doesn't in this case, but they've actually bargained for a share of the productivity to support income, reskilling and redeployment, which means no worker in Sweden at this point are out of work for more than 7 months. That's security and the optimism of a shared future. Now, we're not going to see that in developing economies where we don't even have fundamental social protection floor, and yet it's affordable. Less than 6% of GDP. ODA could kickstart social protection systems. Instead, we're visited with the paucity of a debate about universal basic income on which you couldn't live, let alone pay for health and education and transport and so on. So my point is that the solutions are there, whatever the technology is, except unmanned war drones and the like. I don't think even you and I would want technology to take that direction. But there are some values that we have to underpin even in technology, like human deployment, human control of data, human mediation, and human and labour rights across all businesses.
Rosario, you wanted to come in on this, of course, regulation of technology, a big challenge.
Just briefly. The approach that I think would be useful to keep in mind, I agree that the multilateral, the multi-stakeholder is a very important methods to address this thing, but it's also important to understand that It is time to stop adapting and start steering, just to put it in a slogan way. We've been following what technology causes in terms of opportunities, problems, cost, and try to follow it up and adapt and solve problems as they occur. The time has come that we gain some foresight, that we gain some understanding of what's going to happen, ahead of the curve, and we start design our societies of the future. The job example is a very good case, because it is a matter that concerns our generations, but also future generations. And it's very likely that we're going to shoulder all of the cost of these transformations, whereas also most of the benefits are going to happen in 1 or 2 generations. So it's not just how do we design today's societies or how we share this burden today, but also what kind of interactions we want to have with future generations, how that is going to happen. It is a matter of redesigning our skills, of course. It is also a matter of understanding how do we share value and revenues in our societies, what kind of jobs, how that helps maintaining human understanding and self-determination. So far we have seen in our jobs a way of identify ourselves. I'm an academic at the University of Oxford, and this qualifies me. How this is going to change in 20, 30 years when your job is not anymore who you are, it's more something that you might be doing or not. So I would suggest that aside of the problems that are cogent today, we start thinking about what's going to happen into the foreseeable future, because we cannot afford to have no answer to our children when they will come back to us and say, well, what did you do when this was coming and we saw it coming? It's time to broaden the horizon.
Nathan Batarzek, is Airbnb ready to be steered? Will you be involved in the steering?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to underline that point because I think it's a great one, which is I think, we deal with regulators all around the world, and I see different approaches to that. Most commonly, you see regulators trying to control the rate of change and really trying to maintain the status quo, or at least smooth the transition, as opposed to leaning into the change while also achieving the outcome that the regulator wants to achieve. So, for example, a lot of this change is resulting in increased productivity and increased profits. Well, tax that or take that, harness that, and apply it towards social welfare or whatever it is that is also of equal or more importance, frankly. But harness the new business model and the innovation, and instead of kind of tying it down. And I see a big difference. I spend a lot of time in China, and China's a place I think that embraces a lot of new models very quickly. And if you look at their history, it's not surprising why. I mean, that country in the last 40 years has undergone remarkable transformation. And so the attitude of policymakers there are often that, a new business model equals opportunity. And that doesn't mean it's not regulated, but, it's leaning into that opportunity and then trying to figure out how to incorporate it into the broader context. And I maybe a piece of something I would like to see as regulators approach the new models is, to be users of the product, of these models. I think there's a big discrepancy in terms of the age of most regulators and the age of those who truly understand and use the technology. And so I think it's really hard, and this is complex stuff, and if you don't understand it, if you don't live it every day, then I think it's really hard to imagine and architect that future where there's a certain harmony between the new as well as the real world challenges of people. Maybe you disagree?
Well, it's not the technology. That's the point. And it's not an either-or. If you look at what's happening in the what I call the too big to touch companies, we all know about too big to fail banks. We've now got too big to touch companies. They're convergence of technology and the real world and the actual physical production companies that generate wealth. The big digital companies are saying, well, we can't generate wealth if we're not selling food or financial services or legal services or, content services. I mean, pick a real-world occupation for a worker. No one, least of all us, is trying to say you stop progress. But what we are saying is that you actually have to make sure that people and progress go hand in hand, that the shared prosperity of new tools that generate wealth are simply not going to the 1%. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. That's why nobody trusts globalisation, why we need reform of Bretton Woods institutions, because their conditionality is all about people, because they are listening only to business. Even the OECD survey showed, I think, that, the majority of people actually said just recently that the government doesn't incorporate the views of people. Well, why? Because they're only listening to the corporate lobby. So we say it's not about stopping the future, it is about shaping the future, and frankly, that's in our hands.
Manish, I think you run an international institution of your own, but how do you compare the experience of an organisation like the LSE to, I mean, do you still see the relevance of multilateralism in creating practical policies that will be useful across borders?
Well, before running the LSE, I spent 25 years in the international system at the IMF, at the Department for International Development in the UK, and at the World Bank. And I mean, I think it's very clear that we need international organizations to solve international problems. I think that the problem the international system faces at the moment is that there are huge power shifts going on in society. I mean, we all know that. The world is becoming more Asian. The balance of global power is shifting east and south. And the international system has been slow to adapt to that reality. I sat in, I can't tell you how many long and painful meetings of international organizations trying to figure out how to give China more voice in their governance to accommodate the rise of China. And the system was too slow to adapt. And as a result of that, we have an international system now which is far more fragmented. As the Chinese have grown frustrated, set up their own organizations, there's been a rise in regionalism, and regional organizations have begun to expand. And so our ability to deal with the challenges of climate change, global conflict, global poverty, migration, are now having to be addressed with a system that's far more vulnerable, far more fragmented, and has less credibility with ordinary citizens. And I think it's a really important agenda to fix that, because there's no other way we're going to solve these problems.
Bishop David, do you see that there's a disconnect between the big problems, climate change, global conflict, and what people are experiencing in their daily lives? Is that where the missing, I suppose, the space is, where people aren't kind of connecting global problems to what's happening in their own lives?
I mean, China is an interesting example where I go regularly, like Nathan, for the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we see there are questions about how decisions are made. So we've got this great dilemma of democratic deficit. Is autocracy going to deliver more for the people, or is populism, or is our version of democracy? So that's one thing about how the individual participates in decision-making or not. Second thing is that there you find an extraordinary growth in religious interest since the revolution. And as the openness developed in the 1980s, so then you find that the Communist Party's influence then was waning, and so huge rise, for example, in Christianity in the East Coast cities. Why? Because the government tells us because people need some kind of value system, some kind of structure for their own personal lives that makes sense of their desire to build a better life for themselves, their families, their households, and their society. So there is a disconnect. And so I think the question about our own jobs, our skills, our creativity, questions about how much we need to live on, reveal to us much more about our identity than we think. And so if we can't be creative for whatever reason, because of the skills deficit, because we haven't kept up, if we haven't got much to live on, or not as much as someone else, are we still the same person inside? And are we still the same person that we know? Are we still a full human being? So I think the debate here, for me, also exposes again our own vulnerability as human beings, and what we are thinking, and what ideas get legs that actually work. Influence us beyond we can imagine. So at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, Don Rumfield said Milton Friedman is the embodiment of the fact that ideas have consequences. So and we're touching on that today, and I'm sure in the conference we will question our fundamental ideas and what are they. But at the same time, you might watch the film Wall Street. Most of you are too young to have seen it, 1984 or 5. And Gordon Gekko said, "Greed is good." So let's watch our human tendencies in this. Yes, we are hopeful. We heard, if we were in England, a sermon by an American bishop a weekend ago who said, love is at the heart of our human desire, experience, and what we need more of. So there are these deep, deep personal things that we need to keep in parallel with our structures, our economics, our politics. And I think if we can do that, and we understand that the human being is very fragile, but at the same time very hopeful, a unique part of the human of the creation. The most extraordinary thing is, you know, the most dangerous organism ever to hit planet Earth, as one of the writers has said, but also one of the most responsible. So this has to connect up. Love God, love neighbor is a religious way of looking at it. So that's the personal and the neighbor and the world connected together. And we're holding that together today.
Sharon Burrow.
Well, I think that's right. I think we're strongest when you see people acting together. That's what brings us together. So if you think about the global solutions, people came together around the Paris Climate Agreement after the disasters of Copenhagen, when our planet is still threatened, but at least people came together to find a solution. And it wasn't just governments. It was everybody. It was civil society, faith groups, unions, business folk, some business folk, investors, you know, who had a conscience. And so that's an example. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, I work with businesses who are framing their future business plans around the SDGs. Why? Because they know that the business model has to change. And of course that brings people together. There's courage and compassion. We see it every day. We see people fighting the system on refugees and xenophobia, safe housing, communities, whole communities in Canada, for example, begged the government to allow them to sponsor refugees. In Turkey, you know, the Turkish people, despite their own kind of experience at the moment with essentially authoritarian government, actually call their refugee population guests. I mean, you know, compassion, if we could globalise compassion, I actually think we'd find a lot of solutions. But then Saturday, Ireland, women going back to vote, saying an end to men, sorry guys, telling us about what we can do with our bodies. You know, that was just inspirational. The Me Too movement, silence is not an option, never an option. And so the global deal right here. Stefan Löfven, the Prime Minister of Sweden, running a miracle economy, still with an extreme right, trying to bring it down, but full employment, surpluses, integrated refugees, you name it. And yet we have a situation where he realises that even that's at risk in his country if we don't talk to each other. So the global deal is about promoting the social dialogue, the idea that we have to work together, we have to seal the bargain. I mean, we say very clearly we need a new social contract, and it is about people coming together.
Rosaria, on that, can technology be used to help facilitate this, to help to spread that compassion?
Following up on our point, I think that we have focused the discussion so far in terms of what brings us together, talking about rights and values, but there is one more thing. It's about responsibilities. Facing all these challenges together, it's a duty for all the stakeholders in society. So it's not just the regulators, it's not just the private companies, it's not just the individuals. So I would like to keep also that concept into the picture. Technology, it helps us, and it's fundamental in the context of understanding how we go forward and we shape future realities, because it's become an element of our reality. So we can't afford to overlook technologies, to disregard them when we think about what societies we're going to have, what regulations we want to have. And we should be very much aware that for the first time, perhaps since the commodification of electricity, we have technologies which have stopped to become just tools. They are not just a car. It's not just a washing machine. They have become an agency, a structural agency which reshapes reality, but also the way we understand reality and ourselves. And this is a step that we have all to take, from the regulators to the private companies to the big names, the Facebooks and the Googles of this world, to the individuals. It is in this sense that technology helps us in regulating our societies and our reality. And there is one more thing I wanted to stress, which is that going back to the point of steering technological innovation, we have to make digital technologies, this is the focus of my work, so I talk mostly about that, humanistic again. We haven't done it so far. And it is about understanding that these technologies, they allow us to do more. They free us from tasks which are dangerous, unpleasant, annoying, boring, from mowing the lawn to dig into a mine. In doing so, they free us and they give us chances to do more. Cure Alzheimer with AI, cure diabetes with AI, understand climate change, just to make a few key examples. It's up to us to make sure that we go into this direction. It's up to us to make sure that we use the technologies and their potential to do more bold things, which will be for the good of society. I know it sounds like a very much utopistic thing, but I think there is a chance to go there.
And I think there's a very real opportunity for businesses to incorporate all that we're talking about into their business models and into their activities in a very natural way. Certainly with Airbnb, there's an inherentness about something about literally living in someone else's home that helps you understand the way they live their lives and what their reality is. But beyond that, we've done some interesting things leveraging our community of millions of hosts and millions of guests around the world. For example, we have something we call our disaster relief system. So whenever there's a natural disaster in any part of the world, within a matter of minutes, we can actually send out a ping, send out a message to all our hosts in that area and ask, would they be willing to open up their homes to people in need in their local area? And this was originally inspired by Hurricane Sandy back in New York, and I think 2012 that was. And it was inspired by an actual customer who took it upon herself to do that on Twitter. We noticed it. We created a scalable system for doing so. We've now responded to 90 natural disasters. We've had about 16,000 nights of accommodation offered free of charge. And so, I think it's a really interesting way of using technology to rally people around a shared cause. And certainly a disaster is a really, really clear cause to rally people around. We've done something similar with refugees. We have a program called Open Homes, where we encourage our hosts to host a refugee for a couple weeks as they get acclimated into their more permanent housing. And it's a great way to integrate that newcomer to the community, because the host ends up being not just providing accommodation, but really introducing that newcomer to the neighborhood and helping them to have a friend and get integrated and understand how to live life in a new country.
Manish, Shafiq, does this feed into the idea of reforming a social contract if companies are getting involved in questions like this?
Yes, I mean, I think technology is neutral. It can help our societies hang together, or it can harm it. I remember when the internet revolution started, and everybody had these passionate ideas about how this was going to transform democracy and how we were all going to be much more kind of engaged in public life, and there was going to be public debate, and everyone was going to be much more, it was going to revive and refresh our democracies. When you look at what's actually happened over the last 20 years, voter participation has gone down by 10% in most countries. People treat news like their playlist. They just listen to what they like. And in many ways, our democracies have been eroded. But that's a choice. We could organize it in a different way. And I think that's the challenge that we face. It's the same with the economy. The digital revolution is going to transform jobs. I am not a Luddite who thinks that jobs are going to disappear, but they're going to change. And we have to prepare people for those changes. And just as there is the risk that some people's jobs may be changed fundamentally such that they won't be able to do them, it's also transformed our economy in fantastic ways in creating business opportunities. I see it in the work that I used to do in international development, where small businesses in developing countries can access global markets. The ability to have cash transfers where you can directly put money in a poor person's bank account and much more efficiently deliver support to poor people in some of the poorest parts of the world because of the innovations in mobile banking. That is transformative, and that is a progressive outcome as a result of technology. But I guess my view is it's a choice as to whether it's going to be good for our societies or not.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to build off something Sharon alluded to earlier, which is, I think there are advantages to scale. Bigger business definitely has an advantage over smaller business. And likewise with technology, like what does technology inherently do? It increases productivity. And as you increase productivity, that is an advantage, and it means that power and wealth accrues to a smaller number of people. That's kind of the nature of efficiency. And so I think some of that is an inevitability. The question, though, is, or I think the world we live in today is, as people see that happening, and I think there's no way around it, that's just the nature of the technology that is going to happen. But as people see that happening, I think expectations of business are evolving. And I think businesses do have a bigger imperative to engage in these conversations. We've talked a little bit internally about this concept of a 21st century company. And as a 21st century company, what are the expectations for how you participate in the challenges of the world? And especially if you're trying to build a long-term enduring business, I think it's imperative that you prioritize leaning into those conversations and you find a way to channel your good fortune to address some of the needs. Now, I think the hard part about all this is how do you do it actually in practice? Because the idea is a simple one, but in practice, how you do it is far from clear. And I think especially in our countries, our democratic countries, in order to go from what exists to something new, you need to have a shared vision for the future. And that is getting harder and harder to come by, a shared vision. And part of that's because people consume whatever news they want to, and there isn't anyone curating a dialogue that leads to a consensus and a shared point of view. Instead, there's a fracturing. And so that makes it really hard to, I think, achieve the full potential of this technology that I think could be doing a lot more good than it has effectively accomplished in the last few years.
Well, parts of that I agree with. Business certainly has to do things better and differently, and there are conversations going on, but in fact, as we found in Davos this year, there's a business community that is growing that way, is reaching out to others, is looking to create, in fact, a new social contract. But there are others for whom mergers and acquisitions, the efficiency side of your contribution is everything. And I would have to say, you go back to people and communities. I'm sorry, but if it means that in order to have Amazon sell me food, then the land grabs that go on destroy whole communities, I don't want that. I actually don't want that. If you understand that small to medium enterprise, as much as that's often difficult for us in an organised sense, particularly when the World Bank and the IMF break down the capacity for collective bargaining at national and sectoral level, nevertheless, small to medium enterprise build communities and create jobs. So we have to have a balanced thinking about what that means. And if you listen to the tenor of business where everyone can be an entrepreneur, what does it mean if, in fact, the small entrepreneurs never get to grow to be the 5 million or the 50 billion or whatever companies? And, of course, in the context of small businesses, in the informal economy, we build cooperatives. Our women's movement in India, for example, builds cooperatives, and we are using digital technology to actually get them upstream and downstream supply chains. But they don't think they have to be at a monopoly power level to actually create and build their communities and to provide for their families. When you've got, the fact that competition policy was set up to stop monopoly power, or we used to call it oligopsonies, it's now back to, what do they call it, monopsonies, which is where we're going. And yet the constraints on competition policy stop those freelance journalists from bargaining for a fair contract price, then something's wrong. So we need reform of multilateralism. When the WTO refuses to set a competition floor around global trade, that even as the G20 said last year, you can't have human rights abuses, human and labour rights abuses as part of competition, but the WTO and the governments that sit there with the power of the corporations say no human rights, no labour rights, no environmental standards as the floor of competition, something's very wrong. So we do need to talk. We certainly all need to talk. I think there is a set of shared values, and those who don't want to be in the club of shared values around people, their families, their futures, their communities, their environment should actually get out of the way. But we need to create that, and that's in part what the global deal is between the ILO and the OECD. How do you facilitate a dialogue that will actually bring people together?
So what do you think is preventing more progress?
Well, I think it's pure and simple. It's greed. It's corporate greed. I mean, you know, I think it was Karl Polanyi has said about 30 years ago that if markets are allowed to rule society, then there'll be a backlash from the people, and the consequences can go two ways. One way of fascism or the other way of the Roosevelt New Deal. Well, let's make a choice about that, folks.
Rosaria, I'd like to come back to you on the issue of where we stand in terms of development of technology and all of this. We're talking about there being shared values that need to be shared across communities. The change needs to happen. Is technology going to help us activate that change? Because we've seen the positive and the negative aspects of it, particularly in recent months.
Well, I hope it will, or it does. So technology is not there to provide new profit. Technology is there to allow us either new affordances, do things that we couldn't do before, or to do better things than we ever done before. Try and think about eating a steak without having a knife. You can do it, but it's a pain. It's not worth the effort. So you need a knife to enjoy. The technology is there to make you do something in a better way that you could have done it before. Now, escalate from the knife to transportations, biomedical care, education, entertainment, social interactions. So technology improves societies in terms of affordances and possibilities. It's about then the regulations and the design of these technologies to take us to a better place. There was a famous quote that says, well, technology is neither bad or good, but neither is it neutral. This is because the way you design technologies, the way you regulate technologies, will invite some ways or the other, things going in one way or the other. Now, going to your point, whether technology will help us to regulate and build better societies, there is one thing that we have learned in the past few months. That is that when we as societies and corporate world, for example, forget about social values, social preferability, human preferability, there is a backlash. Companies learn that before than anybody else. You develop a very nice social media infrastructure which allows us to share information and be in touch all together. You forget to take care of privacy properly. Things get out of the way, out of control. The public refuses, or it just stops using your service. Incidentally, there is a loss of 40 million pounds, or dollars. Companies are learning, which are the forefront of the regulations. Those who have, for example, for years articulated the idea of regulating digital technologies are learning now that they need to take into account social values, human preferability, as something that is part of their business models if they want to have profit. And this is a huge opportunity because it changes the dynamic. Regulations don't have to be enforced upon private actors anymore. We can take this opportunity to take the private actors on board and shape with them, with the users, with the citizens, with the regulators, regulations that will support societies. It is a huge shift, and it would be a big mistake to miss on this opportunity, because if we keep regulating technologies as something that has to be stopped, encroached upon, slowed down, it's just about missing the chances to go to a better place. It goes back to the point of staying ahead of the curve rather than just following it.
Okay, at this point, we'd like to open up the floor to questions. If anyone would like to ask a question of our panelists, there are people with microphones in the room around you somewhere, which can, if you'd like to raise your hand, if you'd like to ask a question at this point. Someone down here in the front? Yeah. So if you could just introduce yourself and try to be relatively brief in your question. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to thank all the speakers for their enlightening words. And I really like this. I'm actually working for the Italian Embassy and representation to the OECD. And I'm really in love with this topic that the OECD has decided to pick because I'm a great fan of Isaac Asimov. And so you really managed to speculate on where the future is going. So on this topic, I had a question to pose to Miss Maria Rosaria, and about the future of labor rights when machines are going to take more and more place of workers. what's going to be the future of labor rights for machines? What's going to be the legal status of machines in that regard? Is there going to be any transformation? And also in that regard, if machines are going to have rights, are they also going to bear responsibilities in terms of cybercrime, for example? And since you're an ethicist and a philosopher, I was wondering if you could give your opinion on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm afraid you won't like my answer. Take it from an academic. Starting a question mentioning Asimov, never a good idea. Great sci-fi, brilliant moves, brilliant books. Nothing to do with the reality in which we're in. And it's a distraction. There's going to be another panel, we will focus on this later on. It's a very dangerous distraction to think in these ways. I just published a paper in Nature a few weeks ago about the rights of machines. They should have no rights. Let's not be mistaken. Let's not be distracted by this idea that they should have electric personhood or responsibilities. They remain machines, sophisticated, able to behave as if they were smart, as if they're not, and they're not going to be. So they are tools. We don't hold our tools responsible. Responsibility, moral responsibility, is something that is deeply related to us as human, as being able to understand good and bad, make choice, take decisions, take the blame or the price that follows from it. So machines should never have rights. It's not what they are for. And it's a mistake to think about, especially in regulatory places, that there is even a remote opportunities, because it distracts us from other fundamental questions, which are like, what are the rights of the workers who are going to be integrated in environments in which there are more and more machines? How do we preserve their freedoms, their working hours, their well-being? IBM said that it's a car maker in Germany, say that for every robots that they introduce in their plants, there is one more human operator. So it doesn't mean that there will be more human working with robots. How does that change the way working experience is performed? How do people feel? So let's keep the eye on the real problem. Humans. Humans design, humans use, humans interact with the machines. And that's where we have to focus on. There is a quote from Churchill. You see, I'm Italian, but I've been there in the UK for 15 years, so I drink tea with milk, and there is always Churchill at some point.
Very shared values.
Well, he saved us from a very bad direction we were going on in Italy. So he said, we design and we build buildings, and we shape them. But afterwards, buildings shape us. The same is with all the other technologies. We design them, we use them, we shape them. But then, while we interact with them, they shape us. And it's on these 2 hours, if you wish, that we have to focus. Let's leave sci-fi for Friday night with popcorns and beer. Great. Otherwise, not relevant. Sorry.
Bishop Day, would you like to comment on that point?
Can I just give one illustration of the current level, not the sci-fi level, in the extractive industries, which we're very involved with in terms of the relationship of technology and work. So extracting coal in South Africa is a major employer for that community in the medium and long term to sustain the future of the economy. In Australia, it's possible to ship the same amount of coal just with machines. And so the global industry has this dilemma as to whether the machines should be more efficient, produce a product at a lower price, or should it be part of the bigger picture of society and be a big employer for the foreseeable future?
Any further questions? The man down here in the front, we have a microphone.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. I'm from Mexico. And I'm going to base my question on a guy called David Bruckman that makes a book every year asking one question to brilliant people over the world. And I want to ask this to Nathan. You said technology is moving forward and forward. The main question is, what should we be worried about?
What should we be worried about? I think what we should worry about is not navigating the future in a coherent, designed, and deliberate way. I mean, we face huge challenges going forward. Society challenges, environmental challenges, and they're tough. And if we aren't aligned, and if we aren't deliberate, and if we aren't holistic in our thinking, it's not going to come together well. the complexity of the system has never been so complex. And so I think there is a high hurdle for us to achieve this. And so I think it's going to require a real focus. I think government and multilateral institutions are a great driver of this, but it's got to be followed through. It's going to be complicated. We got to rally our citizens behind this level of dialogue, which seems increasingly hard to do because they're distracted with other things. And so I think at the highest level, that would be my answer.
Bishop David, do you want to comment on that?
I think the thing we should be worried about is the natural human tendency to turn to violence when trapped or when in a dilemma. We've mentioned global conflicts, intra-country conflicts, domestic conflicts, and so in spite of all our wonderful technology, there is that evidence based over thousands of years that we still tend to go to that thing at the end. So avoiding the resort to violence, I think, is one of our fundamental dilemmas that we need to continue to work on very, very hard, realizing our own vulnerability, our own passions, our own weaknesses, our own tendency to go to fear rather than trust, and to focus on that and just restrain ourselves from that.
Emily Shafiq, would you like to speak on that?
I think it's also important, though, to step back and see where we are in the sweep of history. Objectively speaking, things have never been better by any material measure of human well-being. I mean, if you ask most people, what do you think global life expectancy is today, including all the premature deaths in the poorest countries in the world, how long can the average person expect to live? It's 71 years. That's the average, and you all know how averages work. That means, there are a lot of people who live much longer than that. People's incomes are 100 times greater than at the time of the Industrial Revolution on average. Think of all the horrible diseases that we don't think about anymore that used to be the bane of people's lives. And so I think one of the most interesting questions is, why is it that when we're at a moment in history when we are materially better off than any time in human history, there is this fear that exists in so many societies? And I think that fear is about the uncontrollable speed of change, about the fears of future jobs, about fearing that you're falling behind relative to others who are doing much better. And I think fear about the prospects for people's children, and will our children do as well as we did? And so I think that's what we need to figure out, is how do we reassure people about that fear? And I also think it's important to keep a global perspective here. If you look at something called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which looks at interviews about 33,000 people in 28 countries and asks them, which institutions do you trust? Trust is going down massively. In fact, the US has recorded the largest ever drop in trust since they have been recording this. The UK also has seen a drop in trust in the major institutions, government, media, business, civil society. But in most emerging economies, trust is going up. In fact, China has seen the largest increase in trust and confidence that has ever been recorded. But that's the same story for places like India, for South Africa, believe it or not, for a lot of developing countries where people are growing more confident about the future. So it's a more nuanced picture than I think we may be led to believe.
There was another question down here in the front.
Good morning. My name is George Gross. I'm a graduate of the London School of Economics. And I'd like to ask our new director, Minouche Shafiq, what lessons she has drawn from 8 months of being at LSE in the subject that interests us, and as a subsidiary subject, what is the importance of education in bringing everybody together? Well, there's an opportunity for you to expose your ideas.
Thank you. I didn't plot that question.
Neither did I.
I'm delighted to take it. I think universities have a fundamental role to play here. First, the obvious point is they are a vehicle for social mobility and inclusion. For many, many people, going to university is a huge opportunity to change their lot in life. And I think many people can tell stories of that, and I think universities have an incredibly important role to play. They are also hugely important as a place for the kind of dialogue that you were implying. Universities value freedom of speech. Academic freedom is a fundamental principle. It is a place where new ideas, bold ideas, are hammered out in a free and open dialogue. And I think, just as an example, at the London School of Economics, we've spent the last year doing a lot of thinking about what is the future of the welfare state. Welfare states are the mechanisms through which societies look after the old, the young, the disabled, the disempowered, those who fall on hard times. And I think that's a very good example. And we've had, huge debates. We've had 500,000 downloads of our podcasts. We've had public events. We've reached 55 million people around the world through the media, trying to foster exactly that debate. Is if we're going to have a new social contract, and a big part of that is embodied in the welfare state, what does that look like in the 21st century? And I think universities can play a vital role in trying to foster exactly that kind of public engagement.
Sharon?
I mean, I'm a teacher from a very earlier life, and so, of course, education is critical, absolutely critical. But I have to put a discordant view in this, because you come back to the business models again. One of the arguments we're having with the World Bank is a business model that says private companies can actually run whole-scale state education systems, take 15% profit off the top, have untrained teachers, and basically give everyone a tablet where education is prescribed. Now, again, technology is fantastic for knowledge, but is that really the kind of future we want? Or in the context of, yes, harmony is everything to the Chinese government, and there's, I'm one of the people that say wages in European countries like Bulgaria are less than those in urban China. They've got a minimum wages system now in the last decade that's grown faster than anywhere in the world. They're rolling out a social protection system. But look at their investment model in Africa, in parts of Latin America, in Asia. They actually offer to build infrastructure for impoverished governments. Sounds fantastic. They take all of their workers, they pay them in a pittance in Chinese dollars equivalent back in their own country. They're not allowed to socialise with the people. They leave nothing in terms of development in the community. A piece of infrastructure, granted, but that's it. And of course you need then Chinese technology. It's pretty smart, really. Chinese technology to repair and so on. So we've got to get underneath those things as well, because a lot of governments will regulate, will require their business models in their own country to behave in a reasonable way, but then what they export is something very different. Even European companies who are absolutely, used to a social dialogue model in the US will absolutely fight with everything they can the formation of a union and indeed the collective bargaining environment. Why are people poorer in the US? Because shared prosperity is just not there. In fact, I'm reminded of another Churchill quote that somebody used yesterday in humour, and we should treat it that way. But at the height of the rise of fascism and so on, he was asked in Parliament, well, what do you think about unions? And he said, the problem with trade unions is there aren't enough of them. And probably that's the case today as well.
A partisan position from the international...
Churchill and me?
We had some more questions over here. Yeah, this gentleman there in a dark jacket. Someone can...
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. What I've heard up to now is absolutely fascinating. But the future depends on energy, a certain kind of energy, and there's less and less human energy and more energy from money. And over the last decades, what we've seen is something very new. For millennia, loans were based on an underlying good. There was a lien, so to speak. And now we lend on future wealth, on the basis of future wealth. I would like to know what the speakers consider about this future wealth. which means that debt is increasing in an incredible manner by 100,000 euros in France every 43 seconds. Everybody knows that global debt is huge as well. So what are those future sources of wealth that we've cooked up over the last decades that are supposed to solve all our problems?
Debt and how we are, I suppose, preparing our future generations, and what the actions of what's happening now are going to impact future generations. Minouche Shafik, would you like to comment on that?
Yes. I mean, there is no doubt that debt levels grew massively in the wake of the financial crisis. In most of the advanced economies, we're running debt levels of, roughly 40, 50% of GDP, and in many countries that doubled as a result of the bailouts. Not just the direct costs of the bailouts, but because of the slowdown in the economies, the rise in unemployment benefits, and the huge economic consequences of the financial crisis. And you're right that it is a huge problem. It is a huge problem because it has been used to argue for the kinds of austerity policies that we've seen in many countries. And it's a huge problem because, countries have used up a lot of the room that they have for dealing with future shocks. And so if you have another negative economic shock in the period ahead, there will be very little ammunition to fight it because countries have already borrowed at very, very high levels. So you're right to say that is a concern.
Nathan, I'm interested in how you feel this feeds into the idea of building shared values across generations as well, because this is an issue that, debt being borrowed now is feeding into is going to be a problem for future generations.
Well, I think going back to the millennial generation and this being a digitally native generation, I think there's a necessity, perhaps unfortunately, that you become more entrepreneurially minded, meaning that you seek out opportunity. And it is possible now with technology to plug into a global marketplace, Airbnb and travel being one of them, but there's others too. Education, for example. An example of this is this network called VIP Kit out of China, where they have English teachers around the world doing English instruction over the internet. But there are ways to earn supplemental income that haven't been there before, and I think you're seeing young people kind of take it upon themselves to use these as tools to get ahead. In the case of Airbnb, so many people use Airbnb as a way to afford their home, or a way to upgrade what they could otherwise buy. So they get the 2-bedroom apartment instead of the 1-bedroom apartment, knowing that if they can rent it out when they're not there, they can afford a better lifestyle. Likewise with home ownership. Home ownership has gotten increasingly unrealistic for many people. But if you can demonstrate a stream of income, which now in the U.S., Airbnb income is being recognized by Sally May as a stream of income that can then justify and help you qualify for a loan. I think these are innovations that are truly helpful in overcoming what is otherwise a bit of a backslide, making it difficult to achieve the American dream or the global dream, frankly, of upward economic mobility.
Okay, thank you. There was another question from next to that gentleman just spoke last.
Thank you. My name is Leon Horbach. I'm from Amsterdam. I have a question about the threshold for public and private actors to engage in technology for good. As you mentioned, that technology is neutral and can be used for good. I agree. I run an organization that builds digital civic engagement tools that can be used for elections and education, basically based around one-on-one anonymous discussions between political opposites. But in practice, it's still sometimes very difficult to kind of find public and private actors to commit to this kind of non-profit technology sector, because it's not a philanthropy, it's not a real product or a service, but it's still in between, because it's technology, it is a service, but it doesn't make any money yet. So how do you persuade people, especially in the global world, to kind of commit to projects like my own? Thank you.
Minouche.
It's interesting. One of the things we're doing at the London School of Economics is we don't offer an MBA. We're offering a master's in social business to encourage young people to develop businesses with a social purpose. And so launching an incubator, we're just about to launch an incubator which does exactly what you're saying, is pick some social problem and figure out a business model to solve it. And you're right that the commercial side of it is difficult, but on the other hand, if you're willing to live with slightly lower profits, there are some good examples. I mean, I can think of in Bangladesh, for example, BRAC, which is the largest NGO in the world, in fact, have developed a business model whereby they can solve social problems. In their case, for example, solar. They set up a business whereby they provided solar panels for poor households in rural Bangladesh, and they had a payment model whereby people could repay for the capital over a long time period based on the money that they would have spent otherwise on kerosene and other fuels. And it's grown massively, and they developed the repayment model to be exactly how much that poor household would have spent on alternative fuels that were more polluting and less environmentally friendly, but developed a payback model which worked. So I think there are possibilities out there. I just think we have to be a bit more creative in the way we design those businesses and our expectations around how much profit they'll make.
Okay, we're just going to take one more question before I ask our panelists to briefly conclude. A lady over here in an orange jacket. We'll just start with the lady behind you. If the questions are short, we'll do both.
Thank you very much. I'm from the American University in Cairo, and I'm also a graduate of the LSE, so not planted by Minouche again. Nathan, I was scared by something you said, because I was encouraged in the beginning when you talked about the shared economy and millennials and all of that, and that's how I see your company. But then when you talked about efficiency and that naturally it means the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, that to me is neoliberal economics, and that to me is old business models. So I'm a bit confused. You represent a company that is millennial and shared economy and forward-looking, but the ideas about the role of business in society seem to take us back to capitalist neoliberal economics.
Thanks for asking the question. A clarification. I think as a generalization, technology leads to efficiency. Efficiency means fewer people accomplish more, and that results in a concentration of wealth. That's a generalization. I think given that truth, there is a lot of latitude in terms of how you design your business model, how you give back, and how you can empower people. And I think Airbnb is a tremendous example of empowering many people. So as an example, there are millions of Airbnb hosts participating now in the global travel industry. And they set their own prices. They keep 97% of whatever price they set. And most of them do this on a part-time basis. I mean, this is not occupation for them. This is something that actually, generally speaking, requires relatively little time. It's simply taking their underutilized asset, which typically is their most expensive asset in their life, their home, their apartment, and when they're on a business trip, when they're on a family vacation, actually being able to extract a stream of income from that. And as a result, the typical Airbnb host, at least in Europe, is renting their home 30 days a year. So it's very much a part-time thing, and it's resulting in a few thousand euro income. Modest, but substantial enough to be real and helpful. And there are, in Europe, hundreds of thousands, and globally millions of people who are enjoying this benefit. And so I think in doing so, you are empowering the small guy, because otherwise this industry is dominated by big players. As an example, the top 5 hotel companies have the same number of rooms as Airbnb at this point. And so when you stay at a big chain hotel, the profit they earn, where does that go? To your point, it goes to other countries, and it gets reinvested into other countries, building infrastructure in other countries. And yes, some of it goes to the labor, but it's not 97%. It's a much smaller percentage. and there's many different layers of disintermediation there. And so that's, I think, where Airbnb can uniquely and inherently benefit the people. I think there's also a bunch of things we can do to take that further in terms of having guests stay in neighborhoods they wouldn't otherwise stay at, frequent local businesses, et cetera, et cetera. But at the core of it, I do think we're empowering the little guy.
Okay, I'm just going to ask our panelists to conclude briefly as we're just coming up towards the end of our time. We've heard about the shared values of compassion. We've heard about the utility of technology. So I'll ask each of our panelists what they think brings us together going into these 2 days of discussions that we have here, starting with Rosaria.
Okay. I think that what brings us together in this age of the revolution is understanding who we've become and deciding where we want to be. This is something that has to take us. It's a decision that we all have to take together.
Okay, Bishop David.
Just to remind us that certainly in the teachings of the Christian faith, wealth is good, not bad, and our creativity is good, not bad, providing we take responsibility for what we do with it. It's what we do with it that is criticized if it becomes selfish. The image I retain is simply that image of Mahmoud Gassama holding a child that was not his own over a balcony and then meeting the President of France. A refugee, a child in need, and power, all combining to try and make things better.
Manoush Shafik, excuse me.
Yeah, I guess I'd say economic research shows that what makes countries rich or poor is something we economists call social capital. Social capital means the existence of institutions by which people can come together and make decisions about their common future, what we would call coming together. And there's very clear evidence now that that is the biggest driver of what makes countries rich or poor. And we don't measure and put much import on those institutions, but we started to measure it. Things like in the UK, for example, the Office for National Statistics now measures if you're in trouble, do you have somebody who you can go to? Do you talk to your neighbors? Do you have people you can socialize with on the weekends? And valuing those interconnections between people in the way we measure progress, I think will become more and more important as we appreciate how important those ties that bind us are to making us both happy and prosperous.
Okay. Sharon Burrow.
Well, we need a new economic model. I mean, we need a model where business, can actually be reunited with the market serving the community and not the other way around. For working people, we need the security of a new social contract. It's timeless. They need secure jobs. They need to be able to provide for their families, to be able to touch the social protection systems, health, education, childcare. We need equality for women. We need to rebuild our communities as we would want to live our lives, but allow our children and grandchildren to live their lives. And we need a new multilateral world. If we don't reform the multilateral system, if governments can't act together for the interests of people, then the collateral damage is not just conflict and xenophobia, it's our very democracies that in fact are supposed to resolve these problems.
Okay, Nathan Blasarczyk.
I think there's great potential for business and society to benefit one another. And I acknowledge that there's not enough of that happening today, but we shouldn't lose sight of that real potential. That business can drive the prosperity of society, and that the prosperity of society will drive business. And so I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. We should engage in dialogues like these and find a path forward, which is acknowledgedly difficult given the complexity of the world in which we live, the complexity of the technology, the complexity of the business models. But I'm optimistic that there's a path.
Okay, thank you to all of my panelists. Thank you to you for your questions and for your time today. logged out almost at the start, so I wasn't able to see no messages came through on it.
So it was not connected to the internet? Or?
I don't know, no messages appeared and then it logged out. So,
Thanks.
okay.
And he said that it was not logged in. Yeah, okay. So we need to sign it in again. Yeah. Okay. Should I keep it or?